As I mentioned in the fourth lecture, teaching is a relationship based on inequality. The teacher knows something that the student doesn't know and has the responsibility to teach it. The teacher also has the authority to judge the quality of the student's learning and to grade it, to evaluate it. At the same time, the student has the right to expect conscientious teachers who will teach as well as they possibly can and will help students in the arduous and usually very unglamorous business of learning. This lecture is devoted to the question, what sort of relationships should teachers and students have with one another? How much should they get to know one another as individuals, or how much should they maintain the sharp barrier between one another, devoting their energy and attention solely to the subject matter of the class itself? Is it appropriate for teachers and students to be friends? As usual, there's no simple answer to these questions. It depends so much on the age of the students, the subject being taught, the number of hours the students and teachers are together, and the teacher's ultimate objectives. Now, my own view, which is perhaps based on the fact that I was brought up in Britain, which has never had any problem at all with hierarchies, is that there should be a sharp separation between teachers and students. I'm so struck that here in America, by contrast, where faith in equality is almost universal and where it's being drummed into children right from the moment of their birth, everybody's equal. Some teachers are reluctant to act the role of superiors, even in the context of class. They prefer to stress the egalitarian aspect of the relationship between teachers and students. And as you'll hear in excerpts from student interviews, many students also value the chance to befriend their professors and clearly look at them potentially as equals. In the fourth lecture, I looked at these issues from the teacher's point of view. Now I'm going to consider them from the student's vantage point. Well, the teacher-student relationship generally begins in a classroom. You usually meet your students for the first time in a classroom. And the very geography of the classroom itself establishes a special kind of relationship, because normally the teacher is at the front of the class facing the students, and all the students are sitting facing him or her. So straight away the creation of a hierarchy is made by the geography of the room itself. We've already discussed such matters as the importance of knowing the students' names, establishing classroom rules, and I described the way in which I always say to the students, you can't eat, you can't drink, you can't wear a hat, you can't use a computer, you must arrive on time, all these things to create a special atmosphere in the class. These are all the first steps that many teachers take in order to establish the idea that something special is going on. This is a special place and time where a very, very challenging kind of work is going to take place. Now, creating ground rules, just as importantly, helps define the sort of relationship that the teachers and students will have with one another for the duration of the entire class. And the students pick these things up very, very well. They've got a great subliminal ability to understand what the teachers are asking of them. In fact, think about this. The students really, they're the experts on teaching, because they're constantly making comparisons with different teachers. They're experts on good and bad relationships between teacher and student, because whereas I, for example, as a college teacher, only ever go to my own class, with occasional exceptions, the students are constantly going to different classes. They're often studying with 4 or 5 people at the same time and making comparisons continuously about what's actually happening. So it's almost certainly true that they know more about this kind of thing than most of their teachers do, especially because most teachers stop thinking about it. Well, now, what do the students want? First of all, I want the teachers to be enthusiastic about the work, because it makes it so much more pleasant to be in the classroom and much more likely that they'll learn well. Of course, enthusiasm alone isn't enough. The students also want their teachers to be well informed, to have credibility and to have expertise. If the student's stuck and asks a question, they certainly want the teacher to be able to answer effectively. The students who we talk to overwhelmingly praise teachers who are well organised and criticise those whose classes and courses were chaotic. The students want the teachers to set a tone for seriousness of purpose and for professionalism. Just listen to a few of the students we interviewed in the fall of 2009 about what it is that makes this teacher-student relationship effective.
First, enthusiasm, and second, a deep knowledge of the subject.
I think a great teacher, first of all, has to be very knowledgeable about his subject. he has to be extremely passionate about his subject to get anyone to believe him that it's important to learn.
I think the most important thing is just knowing your audience and enjoying your audience. If a college professor doesn't enjoy talking to and interacting with college students, then they probably shouldn't be a college professor.
Personality, availability, really caring more than I could say that I might care if I was a professor, really getting involved, sending emails, checking in on you. I mean, just really being a friend and a professor.
I think a good teacher, well, first, of course, knows what he's talking about, but knows how to explain it in several ways so that students can understand it, and also allows students to have their own room to maybe explain things and to feel like they're understanding it on their own, not just being told.
I thought it was delightfully candid of the one student, the one in the purple sweater, to say that she already anticipates that if she were a professor, she wouldn't be as conscientious as she expects her own professors to be. That's setting the bar very high indeed, but it's an interesting little insight on her part. No real surprises in what those students said. You'd expect them to say, of course, we want them to be enthusiastic, well-prepared, attentive, and so on. Now listen to a group of students talking about what they don't like. It's really just the negative image of the same things.
They just basically will present the same material from the textbook or from the lectures or whatever other supplementary material that there is. And I just really feel like I don't gain anything from actually attending class.
Be more interested in their own research than they would be in addressing the subject to the audience.
I definitely don't like when professors read strictly out of the book. You know, they're reading, there's no creativity, there's no outside insight.
They're not there when they show up to class. They're not excited about the material, or that they only teach their material and they're not looking for input from the classroom. So they want to just go in, teach, and leave.
I had a teacher who was sort of very removed from the classroom and didn't care about the students. She told us that when we didn't understand something to just go read the book.
There's a fairly consistent refrain there among those voices, isn't there? You've got to do more than just tell the students to read the book. Although it's certainly useful to have a book to reinforce what the professor's saying, the classes have got to do more than simply reiterate what the book has already said. The students love enthusiastic and well-organised teachers who know a lot about their subject, and they dislike unorganised teachers who don't appear to care. My own experience, and that of many of my colleagues, also suggests that students respond very well to teachers finding the humorous side in what they're studying. Incidentally, it's often the case that students are, because they're in class, they think they must be in an area which is almost immune to humour, and it often takes a moment for them to understand that what's happened, that what's been written or what's been said has got a humorous element to it at all. Here, for example, is a little clip of a moment in my freshman seminar when the student doesn't realise at first the comical aspect of what he's just read. He's so focused on the idea that this document from 1799 must be serious, he's surprised to discover that it's humorous.
Far beneath his acceptance.
Next sentence.
This is non-exaggeration, never was constant.
No, stop. You see that? What's so clever about that is he gives you this wild exaggeration, and then he says, this is not an exaggeration. That's a very... Yeah, it's a beautiful thing, isn't it? He implies that everything we knew about human motivation and ambition has been completely turned upside down. He gives you this deliberate, extended exaggeration. It's not an exaggeration. Yeah, it's a very nifty trick. Well, that's a good example of a student failing at first to grasp the humorous aspect of something that he's read, although he was a lightning-fast student who quickly understood what was going on. On the other hand, you do need to be careful with humour in the classroom. You need to make sure that it isn't hurtful. Sometimes it's possible, indiscreetly, to make a remark which a student will find a little bit wounding because it reflects unfairly on, or unflatteringly on their own ability. But even more importantly, you've got to make sure that you don't say something absurd or jokingly that students might misconstrue as being truthful. And again, this is just a matter of remembering the fact that to us it's all very familiar, but to the students often it isn't. And so you might say something which seemed to you so obviously absurd it couldn't possibly be construed as truthful, and yet the students took it, oh, well, that's part of the course as well. Hadn't really understood that. So never misunderstand some students' ability, never underestimate some students' ability to misunderstand. Your humour is useful, but like everything else you do as a teacher, it should always be in the service of stimulating better learning. That's really the test to apply. Now, I have discovered that most students want some sort of relationship with their teachers that includes an interest in them and in their lives and in their aspirations that goes beyond just the materials of the course itself. Even though this is something I'm leery of and tend to discourage a little bit, I have to admit that there's a very broad consensus among the students in favour of it. They certainly do respond very favourably to teachers who learn their names early on and who recognise them as individuals, something I certainly do try to do, and there's no problem there. I mentioned this in the lecture on what you should do in your first class, and you perhaps recall that I asked the students to make a name card and hold it for a photograph, and I take the photograph with my digital camera so that I can learn everybody's name very quickly in the space of the first week. Now that activity instantly creates a connection between each student and me. It draws them into the community of the classroom, and at some level it makes them feel valued. Also, as they watch one another being photographed, they see each other's names, which otherwise would take a very, very long time to accumulate. I expect you've all been in a situation where week after week you're with some people, but you still don't know what their names are, and you become increasingly uncomfortable because you don't know their names. This is a good way of avoiding that kind of problem. Students overwhelmingly like to have easy access to their teachers outside of class hours. Now, most college professors, me included, offer students the opportunity for more interaction by holding office hours. Your relationships with your students will strengthen if you always keep your office hours, if the students can go at a certain time and dependably find you there. And better still, if you say to students, if you can't make it to my regular scheduled office hours, please call me or please email me and I will arrange to meet you at another time. And then always keep those meetings. It's very hurtful to students to make an arrangement and then not bother to show up. Now, the students need you most or want to talk to you most when papers or exams are getting close to their deadlines. What's the experience of office hours like? Well, my experience is this, that in office hours, the people you see most are the very best students and the very worst. The best ones come because they're getting a lot out of the course and they're enjoying discussing it for reasons that go beyond merely their ability to get good grades. Most professors find that a handful of students in any given year turn to them for advice and for the beginnings of a mentoring relationship. And as I mentioned before, this is one of the real delights of teaching, the opportunity to build strong relationships with students who are talented in your subject and who are already thinking ahead to the possibility that they might actually make it their own life's work. And of course, for me, it's a pleasure to talk to gifted history majors who say, I'd like to be a historian. Well, I love spending time with such people and trying to make that begin to turn into a reality. Now, on the other hand, the other people who come to your office hours a lot are the worst students in the class. They visit because they're in trouble and they need help. Or else they've missed assignments and you require them to come to see you. Of course, sometimes the worst students won't come unless you absolutely compel them to do so because they know they're in trouble and they respond to it with evasion. But there are opportunities here too. Sometimes when a reluctant or a poor student comes to see me, I try to make the environment weirdly unintimidating. I think they're expecting that they're going to be put on the carpet. And so I try to draw them in and chat about what's going on and do what I can to find out what's going on. Sometimes they've got problems in their personal lives, which I usually don't want to get into. Sometimes they've got conceptual issues. Occasionally they're just simply not very interested and not very motivated. But even there, you can often guide a student onto one aspect of a course which might spark his or her imagination and interest. And we'll talk more about one-on-one teaching, which can be marvellous, a little bit later in the course. Now, it's also true that quite a lot of students won't come to office hours unless they're encouraged quite strongly. One problem that you come up against in teaching classes is student peer pressure against sucking up to the professor. The idea that if you go to the office hours, what you're really doing is you're just sort of sucking up to the professor, currying his or her favour in order to get a good grade. And of course, it's true that some students do suck up to the professors for the sake of better grades. I think we're all quite good at noticing which ones they are, and we certainly discuss among ourselves the way in which some students are trying to manipulate us in that way. But of course, there are others who would like the advice, but they fear that they'll look like suck-ups, and so they don't come, even though otherwise they would have done, because they're interested in the subject. I do have colleagues who require students to attend their office hours 3 or 4 times every semester. This is a way of getting over their reluctance. And of course, if everybody's going to come, the ones who wanted to come all along don't stick out anymore. But then, of course, there's the problem that you're going to spend a lot of time with students who are just in the middle of the class, in which there isn't really all that much to be said, because they haven't done enough additional work to talk intelligently about that. Neither are they bad enough to need remedial attention. The students who constitute the big grey middle, they're willing to do the necessary minimum of work, but they don't think of college mainly as an academic activity, and therefore they don't devote any extra time to academic affairs. In fact, I'm struck by how few students at high-priced colleges, such as the one where I teach, where the tuition is now $40,000 a year, they're paying for access to the professors, but they don't very often avail themselves of it. There's a very striking contrast between what happens when they're prospective students touring the campus with their parents, when the guide says, now here on this campus, we have a very, very favourable student-professor ratio, and the students will always have easy access to their teachers. And the parents are nodding enthusiastically because they like the sound of that. And the kids are also looking affirmative about it in a general way. But the reality when they get to campus is they don't come to see you as much as you might like. The best of them appreciate their teachers' willingness to advise them on issues relating to their current difficulties and their future careers. And let me digress for a moment here to talk about the letters of recommendation issue, which increasingly is becoming a big concern for professors and also for high school teachers. To get to the next stage in your life, you need letters of recommendation. High school kids going to college have to have letters. College kids going to graduate school or professional school or into the workforce need letters, and so on. And unfortunately, a tendency has developed for the letters all to be written in terms of great effusiveness. And that means that the students have got to have them, but they've got to have ones which make them sound better than they really are. They've almost got to be insincere. If you told the blunt truth about 99% of your students, you'd condemn them to not get the job or not get the position in an advanced school that they're hoping to get. So one of the many things you've got to do as a teacher is decide early on what your principles are going to be in the matter of letters of recommendation. Whenever possible, you should agree to write them because the students have got to have them. But if you have a student and your memory of that student is of consistently poor work, you need to say, I won't give you a letter of recommendation. Because you'd either have to tell lies or you'd have to pretend to the student that you were going to give a good one when actually you weren't. You were going to give a rather bad one. Even with the ones who you're most enthusiastic about writing for, problems come up. Students have, conscientious and scrupulous students have often said to me, I'm ever so sorry, Dr. Allett, but can I ask you for another letter of recommendation? Now, on the one hand, you think, oh, please, not another one. I've already written 800 this year. But on the other hand, with the people whom you admire and support, you definitely should say yes. And you should say yes for reasons which are referred to in sociology as serial reciprocity. The student you write for can't give anything back to you. But on the other hand, you would only have got to the position you're in now because other people were willing to do it for you. In other words, I only ever became a graduate student and then a professor because my teachers at various stages along the way wrote letters on my behalf. I can't repay the favour to them, but I can pay it down to the next generation. And so I actually say this to students. Please don't feel bad about asking. I'm very, very happy to give you this letter because it's a fulfilment of my responsibility to my own patrons in the past. Now, I asked a selection of students in the fall of 2009 whether they wanted their professors to get to know them better as people, and most of them said yes, as you'll see here. So you'd like to be friends with the professors if possible?
Yeah, I think when personalities come together and interests come together, it's a nice thing to be friends with a professor who you also respect as a mentor.
It creates that comfort level, and having that comfort level is, I think, very important because then you're able to go to the office hours and you feel more comfortable being one-on-one with the professor and talking about your tennis match or talking about your presentation and your performance, and then you can get into the subject matter.
So do you think in general it's good for professors to know their students outside of the class and to develop a richer relationship with them than just what's happening in class?
Yeah, most definitely. He has so many more experiences to offer than just what he's offering in the classroom. So he has to reach out, teachers have to reach out and speak to students outside the classroom and see how else they can help.
It makes me more comfortable, or makes me more confident in the teacher if they'll ask me, what other classes are you taking, or what do you want to do after you graduate? I feel like they have a more invested interest in my future as a student.
Well, fair enough. They're almost unanimous in wanting that kind of relationship. But it's important not to let the students manipulate your willingness to lend a sympathetic ear. And one thing you're going to have to do as a teacher is decide where you're going to draw the line. Early on, I realized through painful experience, trial and error, not to let students talk to me about their boyfriends and girlfriends, particularly not if this was a prelude to them telling me why they hadn't handed in their work on time. You see, really, that would be a matter of offering favoritism to those who felt less reticent about such confessions, even assuming they're true. By comparison with those who kept their anguish to themselves, how do I know which ones are going through terrible hardships with their boyfriends and girlfriends if some tell me but some don't? If I reward those who do tell me, I'm not really responding impartially to the class as a whole. That's very much worth keeping in mind. As a beginning teaching assistant, when I was a graduate student at Berkeley, I made an absolute classic mistake in this respect with a student called Louisa. Almost from the beginning of the semester, she had endless troubles and she was constantly coming to my office hours and weeping. She was a very talented weeper, in fact. I never found out whether what she was telling me about this relationship was true, but in those days I hadn't thought through the implications of not letting her tell me. Here's how you need to think about it. Even if it was true that she was having a horrible time with this boy about whom I heard much more than I really wanted to, even if it was true, she was still manipulating me, and I didn't yet know enough to prevent it. Now what happens is this. As soon as the word boyfriend passes from a student's lips, I say, stop, stop, in a loud, clear voice. I won't let them tell me. Sometimes the student breaks down into tears, and I just hand over the big toilet roll, which in my office stands in for Kleenex. I'm aware that a lot's going on in their personal lives, but I'm also aware that from my point of view as their history teacher, I can't help. Sometimes I'll say, well, we have trained counselors who can help you in this way, but we're going to keep the study of history entirely distinct from what's going on in the rest of your life. That's again why the idea of special time is so useful. Now, there are students who recognize that differences in age and power between them and me make all kinds of interactions inappropriate. Since teachers are sometimes symbols of the anxiety students face, many of them would prefer to leave their teachers behind when class is done and maintain a healthy professional distance from them. I certainly don't mean to imply that all students are hungry for some kind of personal connection. With many of them, it's obvious that they spend just the absolute minimum of time in your company and not a minute more. So in other words, these barriers are being set up from both sides. I'm creating it, sometimes they are as well. So teachers, you need to, in any learning situation, both at school and in college and in the workplace too, you need to draw a fine line between, on the one hand, encouraging and sympathizing with and taking an interest in the people under your care, and on the other hand, becoming personally involved with them. It's difficult to draw the line. Here's Michael Roberto reflecting on this balance in a very intricate way.
Is the professor around? Are they on campus? Do they have office hours? I like to have lunches. So what I do is at the beginning of every semester, I offer voluntary sign-ups for small groups of students, 3s and 4s, to have lunch with me. And the only rule of those lunches, two rules. One is they're voluntary. You don't have to have lunch with me. And the other is we can't talk about the class. We can talk about anything in life, any book you've read, anything other than the course. The professors who don't do that, don't reach out to get to know students, aren't trying to learn their name, aren't available, to me, that's bad teaching.
Now, you said earlier that you discovered early on the importance of wearing the jacket and tie as a way of differentiating yourself from the students. But presumably the effect of the lunches is to bring you closer. Where do you draw the line between appropriate and inappropriate involvement in the student's life?
It is a very fine line you have to be very careful about. And sometimes the students misjudge that, right? And that's for sure. So I'm a stickler, for example, on arriving on time. Good morning. Today's Disney case, I want to start with some stock data. And what will happen sometimes, you develop a great rapport with students, and halfway through the semester, they start, they start strolling a minute or two late, thinking there's no repercussion, even though they knew that at the beginning of the semester I was incredibly harsh about people walking in late. They somehow think, well, now we've had lunch with him, and you've got this rapport, and so sometimes they misjudge it, and sometimes that's our fault, right? And we have to be careful about that. They do call me Professor Roberto. I do typically wear a tie and a jacket, and I typically expect them to meet certain standards in the classroom of decorum and arrival on time, professionalism. On the other hand, I want to get to know them, and I want them to feel like if they have a problem or there's any issue that the door's open, they can come, and I can help them with their careers and the like. But it is a delicate balance.
One thing to bear in mind is this, that as a teacher, you need to conquer the temptation to want to be liked. I mean, it's the most elementary aspect of human nature. You want people to like you. But as a teacher, it can only be a very subordinate concern. Having the students like you is a welcome side effect when it happens, but it mustn't be the teacher's principal objective, because it's going to contaminate everything else he or she is trying to do if it becomes the primary objective. As I said, the students have not come to class to make a friend. Friends don't give each other grades. Friends don't evaluate how successfully you've completed a course of professional training. Teaching's not a relationship among equals, any more than in the business world the relationship between you and a supervisor might be. So in the question of being liked, certainly you should teach so well and with such energy and enthusiasm and with such obvious expertise that the students think, what a marvelous teacher he is. I'm so glad to be in his company, and I do like him. But that's a side effect. What you've got to be asking is, am I helping the students learn? If being likable helps, it's fine. But being liked mustn't be your objective. Now, there's clearly an important gender dimension to this question. Female faculty members, I've talked with a lot about this, and I think they face particular difficulties in this regard. I used to be the director of Emory's Centre for Teaching and Curriculum. For 5 years, I was its director. And we had regular workshops on matters like the appropriate teacher-student relationship. Very often, women faculty members said to me, the students want to be their mom, or they want me to be something like their mom. If I'm distant, if I'm conscientious in upholding the line, they think I'm being cold and unfeeling and insensitive. And I think it's probably true that women faculty members have a more difficult time calibrating that relationship. I hope it goes without saying that romantic or sexual relationships between teachers and students are inappropriate. This was a point also that I made in Lecture 4. But we hear about them all the time at many levels, and they used to be far more common than they are now. Back in the 1960s and 1970s, many university departments were full of professors who'd married their graduate students. It had become almost a tradition in some places. Now today, it's regarded as a form of harassment, and rightly so, because of the inequalities of power between teacher and student. Even if there's plenty of goodwill on both sides, still they are unequal. Having said that, I should also add that it's never going to stop, because there's an emotional intensity to teaching and learning. Slightly different than crushes on professors, although often indistinguishable, is hero worship. It's very, very gratifying indeed when you realize that one of your students hero worships you. You need to be aware of it, but you mustn't abuse it. Don't let it go to your head, and don't start believing the hype. If you're inexperienced and you think that a student has a crush on you or is trying to seduce you, you must notify your immediate superiors verbally and in writing straight away. You need to create a record to be sure, and you also need to be sure that you don't meet this student behind closed doors. In other words, it may not come to anything, but anticipate the difficulty as early as you can. On the positive side, you can sometimes use hero worship to your advantage by holding students to very high standards. And by holding out to them the idea, I'm only going to give you the approval that you want from your hero if you achieve the very loftiest standards, and you deliver this message in a slightly haughty and removed tone of voice. Keep this in mind as well. There's an inescapable moral element in the teacher-student relationship, and it has implications for the students' future lives. Even teachers who devote themselves solely to the subject of the course are offering themselves as role models. Ideally, they're communicating to the students, I'm acting in a way that you should learn to emulate. In graduate and professional education, teachers are modeling the professionalism that their students should learn. And think about this too. What you do in class can have effects for many decades. Just think of advice that a teacher once gave you that you're still acting on decades or years later. So to sum up, never forget that the students are developing an attitude towards you at the same time as you're developing an attitude towards them. Try to get a sense of what they want, and when it's useful, gratify them. In deciding how to interact with your students, you should always make sure that your manner and attitude and the behaviours and habits you expect of them are going to help them learn the subject of the course and the required way of thinking. You should never show signs of favouritism or special preference, which is a perversion of the proper relationship between teacher and student, and deeply unsettling both to the favourite and to those who are not favourites. On the other hand, you should show an interest in your students, learn their names, help them in ways appropriate to your unequal status, and show them that they mean a lot more to you than merely names on a list. Eating with them, mentoring, offering advice in office hours, writing letters of recommendation, these are central to most professors' lives, and rightly so. These, again, are things we're going to revisit when we do a lecture a bit later on in the course on one-on-one teaching. Be mindful of the risks of personal or intimate relationships between teachers and students. Some sorts of issues, concerns and aspects of their lives are inappropriate for a student to share with a teacher, and vice versa. Keep the focus always on learning. And finally, keep in mind the implications for the future of your relationship with your students: practical, professional and moral. Ideally, you'll still be guiding them years after you meet them for the last time. Well, now that we've covered these general questions of planning and relationships, I want to devote the next few lectures in this course to the nuts and bolts questions of lecturing, presentations, demonstrations, seminars, and teaching writing.